On a June evening in 1824, a gamekeeper walked into the Hit or Miss Inn to buy tobacco. Days earlier, in that same taproom, a poacher had said the words that would help send 2 men to the gallows. Come in then, before that rain follows you properly through the door. There, get it shut behind you, good and firm. The latch on this one needs a bit of persuading. Now give me that coat, soaked through as it is, and I'll hang it by the settle there. It'll steam itself dry soon enough with the fire going like that. Sit yourself down. That chair's closest to the hearth, and nobody else has a claim on it tonight. I'll pour you something while you get the feeling back in your hands. There. Get that down you, slow now. No need to rush it. You've earned it. Coming through weather like that. Good. Now you're settled. I'll tell you something about places like this. Places that have stood as long as this one has. A pub hears things before a court ever does. That's not a figure of speech. Men come in off the land, off a day's work, and they talk, because that's what a fire and a drink and a room full of familiar faces does to a man. He says things he wouldn't say to a magistrate, wouldn't say to a vicar, might not even properly admit to himself in the cold light of morning. And mostly, that's all it ever is. Talk. The room hears it, and the room lets it go, the way a room does. Mostly. I want to take you back now. Not far, not in miles, but in years a fair way. 1824, and a place called Wychwood Forest, over in Oxfordshire. Now, if you've heard of Wychwood at all, you'll likely have heard of it as something pretty. Ancient woodland, the kind they paint on calendars. Forget that picture for tonight. In 1824, Wychwood was not a place you walked through for pleasure, not if you lived nearby. It was a forest with an owner, and the owner had keepers, and the keepers had guns, and everyone for miles around understood exactly what that arrangement meant. It meant deer, and deer meant meat, in a part of the country where a labourer's wages did not stretch to meat, not most weeks. A man with an empty pot at home and a forest full of venison on his doorstep was not, in his own mind, a criminal. He was a man solving a problem. The law saw it rather differently, and the law had teeth of its own. Transportation, prison, worse. But hunger has never much cared what the law thinks of it. So poaching went on. It always had. And the keepers watched for it, because that was their living, and because the great landowners, men like Lord Churchill, expected it of them. One name that came up when people talked about poaching round Wychwood was William James. He was known for it, the way certain men in certain villages, unknown for certain things, spoken of with a kind of weary familiarity rather than surprise. And there had already been bad blood over it, specifically over a doe that had gone missing, venison that somebody reckoned belonged to them, and somebody else reckoned belonged to whoever could carry it home. That sort of accusation doesn't fade. It sits. Now, there had been an underkeeper, a man called Henry Bayliss, whose job it was to walk the rides and coppices and keep half an eye on men exactly like William James. Bayliss gave that work up, walked away from it. He never wrote down his reasons in any way that survives, but the timing of it, and what came after, has led people ever since to draw their own conclusions about how safe that work had come to feel. Into Bayliss's place stepped a younger man, James Millin, assistant keeper now, given the same rides, the same coppices, the same men to watch. Not far off, near Paynes Farm in the Swinbrook Valley, stood a small pub called the Hit or Miss Inn. Long gone now, that place, but it stood then, kept by a man named Henry Jesty. An ordinary little house. Tobacco, a fire, men in off the fields with the day still on their boots, and it was in that taproom, in the weeks before anything happened, that certain words were said. We know this because later, in a courtroom, men stood up and repeated them under oath, which is a very different thing from a man muttering something into his ale and trusting the room to forget it by morning. One of those men was John Bayliss. He told the court that he had been at the hit or miss when William James stopped him. The words Bayliss repeated were these: "Stop, my friend. Once upon a time thy master killed a doe for me, and I would cut his head off as soon as a butterfly's, if I could get the chance, and I should not stand out upon another one's." Bayliss, hearing that, replied, "Perhaps that's me." And James answered, "Thee has got to find that out." Now those words were not written down in the taproom. They came later, repeated under oath, after everything had changed. But that is why they matter. A pub hears a thing first. A court only hears it afterwards. Another man, James Holliday, gave evidence of something said separately that William James had remarked, plainly enough for Holliday to remember it years later in a courtroom, that he should like to chop off Millin's head that night. That is what the room held, in the weeks before the 15th of June. Words said, perhaps, the way men say such things, half meaning them and half not, trusting that a pub forgets. On the evening of the 15th, James Millin walked towards the hit or miss inn for nothing more than a pouch of tobacco. An ordinary errand. He had no way of knowing that the room he was walking into already held those words, waiting, the way a pub does, for someone to come back for them. The evening went on as evenings do in that part of the world in June. Light lingering long after most folk would have liked it gone. The heat of the day settling into the hedgerows and not wanting to leave. James Millin reached the hit or miss inn a little after 8, stepped inside, out of habit more than need, the way a man does when his round takes him past a door he knows well. He had a few words with Henry Jesty behind the bar, nothing that anyone thought worth remembering at the time, paid for his tobacco, and went back out into the evening, turned his steps towards Hensgrove Coppice, as he would most evenings, walking the edges of the wood while there was still light enough to be useful, and just enough dust to make certain men think the cover was good. Not long after, a shot sounded from somewhere among the trees. Now, in a forest like that, in a summer like that, a single shot was not in itself a thing to stop a man's work over. There were others out in the fields and along the hedges that evening, finishing what daylight allowed, and when that first crack came rolling out of the wood, most of them did exactly what you or I might do. Glanced up perhaps, carried on. One shot meant little. Wychwood had its own noises, and that was simply one more of them. It was the second shot that changed things. That came later, close to 9:15, and it was different, louder, closer, or carrying further, or simply landing in the ear differently than the first one had. Men who had let the earlier shot pass without a thought stopped what they were doing this time, put down a tool, looked towards the trees in a way they hadn't before. A local man, Thomas Young, went towards the sound, not at a run, not at first, walking the way a man walks towards something he half hopes will turn out to be nothing. It was not nothing. He found James Millin among the trees of the coppice, alive, but only just, and in no state to give Young the kind of account that could be carried straight to a constable and acted upon. What he managed, what was later put before the court, was a single word: murder. That was the whole of it. No name given, no description offered, just the word itself. said by a man who, of all the men in that valley, would have understood exactly what weight that word carried. Word of this sort does not stay still. Within a short while, Joseph Millin, James's brother, was making his own way towards the coppice, calling out as he went, getting back nothing he wanted to hear. And here is where the evening takes the turn that mattered later to a great many people. Two men appeared near the wood, William James and Henry Pittaway, dressed plainly as a man dresses for an ordinary evening at home. Pittaway had a billhook with him, the kind of tool that might be in any man's hand on any evening for any number of reasons. They said they had heard a cry of murder, same as everyone else by then, and had come to see what the matter was. On its own, that is nothing. A cry like that goes up, and neighbours come. That is simply what neighbours do. But Joseph noticed something, the kind of small thing that means nothing at the time, and a great deal afterwards. Along that stretch of the wood, there were several gaps where a man might step in among the trees. James and Pittaway passed 3 of them, walked on past 3 perfectly good ways into the coppice, and went in by the one nearest to where James Millin lay. Joseph said nothing about it that night. Why would he? His brother was on the ground, and there were more pressing things than which gap a neighbour had chosen. Between them, the men carried James Millin towards South Lawn Lodge, where whatever could be done for him was done. It was not enough. He died there that night. By the next morning, Swinbrook was not the same village it had been the day before. Nothing you could point to, mind. The cottages stood where they always had. Smoke still rose from the same chimneys. The forest had not moved an inch. But doors that had stood open through the warm evenings shut a little sooner now. Voices that had carried easily across gardens dropped to something quieter. And in more than one house, a gun that had stood in its usual corner for years suddenly found itself somewhere else. Wrapped, moved, put where a visitor's eye would not fall on it first. People noticed that sort of thing in a village that size. They noticed who had been seen where and when and how. They noticed which men in the days that followed seemed a little too ready with an account of their evening, an account that fitted together a little too neatly for something that was supposed to have happened by chance. And in more than one mind, words that had been said in the hit or miss in over the past weeks, about does' heads and butterflies, about what a man might do given the chance. Words that had seemed like nothing more than ale talk at the time, began to sit rather differently. Lord Churchill did not wait for the local constables to find their feet. He sent word south, to London, to Bow Street, asking for a kind of help that Valley had never needed before. And so a man named William Salmon set out from the city, heading into a valley where by then very nearly everyone knew something. Whether everyone was willing to say it was quite another matter. William Salmon reached Swinbrook within the week, and by every account he must have seemed a strange sort of creature to the people there. London policing was a young thing in those days, barely out of its own infancy, and a Bow Street officer walking the lanes of an Oxfordshire valley was not a sight anyone in Swinbrook had grown used to. He did not know the families, did not know who had married whom, who owed whom for a debt going back years, who had not spoken to a neighbour since some falling out nobody outside the parish could explain. What he did know was how to look at a place and ask the sort of questions that did not announce themselves as questions. He found a bullet mould in a spot where it had no obvious business being. He found guns that had been moved since the night of the 15th, hidden in places a man does not usually trouble to hide his gun, and explanations for that hiding that did not quite agree with each other when set side by side. He found footprints near the gap in the wood, the same gap Joseph Millin had watched two men walk into. And he found remarks, things said in the days after the murder, by men who perhaps believed the matter had already settled itself, and that nobody was listening any longer. None of it, taken alone, would have been enough to hang a man. There was no witness who had stood in that coppice and seen a hand on a trigger. What there was, instead, was a great many small things, none of them quite explaining themselves, all of them pointing the same direction. And there were the words from the hit or miss in. Talk in a taproom does not, by itself, prove what a man did, but talk in a taproom about cutting off a man's head as soon as a butter flies, about what might be done given the chance. Talk that a man stood up and repeated afterwards as having been said in earnest, that does something else. It does not show a hand on a trigger. It shows a mind that had already, weeks before, gone to a place a mind ought not to go. And a court, faced with everything else Salmon had gathered, was entitled to wonder whether that mind had stayed there. The trial was held at Oxford Town Hall on the 30th of July, 1824. Mr. Justice Park presided, and the case for the Crown was put by Mr. Taunton. The evidence went in, the words from the inn among it, and the jury withdrew to consider what they had heard. They were back inside 15 minutes. William James and Henry Pittaway were found guilty of the murder of James Millin, and the sentence the law provided in those days for murder was passed upon them both. Hanged, and afterwards anatomized, their bodies handed over for dissection, so that even in death there should be nothing left over for a decent burial. It was meant to be seen, meant to be talked about, in pubs very much like this one, for a long while afterwards. They were executed at Oxford Castle on the 2nd of August, only days after the trial had closed. To the end, by what was recorded, both men maintained they were innocent. I won't tell you what to make of that. Men condemned to die have said as much before, the guilty alongside the innocent, and the record cannot sort one from the other for us now. You'd think that would be the end of it. A pub, some hard words, a death in a wood, a trial that took less time than this conversation has, and a rope. The sort of thing that gets written down once in a parish register or a county paper and is otherwise left to settle into the ground along with everyone involved. But there's one more thread, and I'll give it to you carefully, because it isn't the kind of thing you can hold up as fact. 100 years on, in 1927, an old woman who remembered the trial, or remembered being told of it by those who'd been there, passed on something that had apparently been kept quietly in the area all that time. The story concerned a man called John Kibble, and the claim was that, on his deathbed, Kibble had confessed to firing the shot himself, that he'd aimed at movement in the bushes that evening, thinking it was a deer, and only understood afterwards what he'd actually hit. Now, that is not evidence. It was never tested, never put against the bullet mould or the footprints or anything Salmon gathered. A century afterwards, the story had changed shape, the way stories do when they're kept by people rather than by courts. That is not proof, but it is the sort of thing a village keeps, when a verdict was reached in 15 minutes and never quite sat right with everyone who heard it. And that, I think, is the truest thing in this whole business. Not whose hand was on the gun that evening in Hensgrove Coppice, but that a pub is not only where men drink, it's where words sit and wait, sometimes for the assizes, sometimes for 100 years, until an old woman, by a different fire, finally says what she'd heard. So here's to James Millin, who went into a pub for tobacco and walked out into a story that never quite left the valley. And here's to the words men think are only words, until a witness remembers them. Now finish your drink, if you're going to. The rain's eased a little, and the road will be darker under the trees. Mind how you go, and if you hear men talking too loudly in a quiet pub, don't be too quick to forget what they said. You've been listening to British Pub Law. Mind how you go.